The night Susanna Winslow rode hard into the teeth of a Colorado blizzard with $3,000 in stolen bank notes stuffed into her saddlebag. She was certain of exactly two things. She was the most wanted woman in the Colorado Territory, and she was going to die before morning. The year was 1878, and the mountains above Gunnison were not the kind of place a person wandered into without preparation, experience, or a healthy respect for what nature could do to a human body when it set its mind to the task. Susanna had the first quality in reasonable supply, the second in modest quantity, but the third she had always lacked entirely. She had spent the better part of her 24 years treating consequence as something that happened to other, less clever people, and the mountains had taken notice. The storm had come on fast, the way storms always did in the high country, rolling down off the peaks with a kind of gleeful malice that seemed almost personal. One moment she had been riding under a sky the color of pewter, the wind cold but manageable, the trail ahead of her faintly visible in the fading afternoon light. The next, the world had simply disappeared. White consumed everything, the trail, the tree line, the horizon, the very concept of direction itself. Her horse, a tough little roan mare she called Cinder, had balked twice and then lowered her head and pushed forward because Susanna had demanded it, and Cinder was the only living creature on earth who consistently did what Susanna demanded. But even Cinder had limits, and they were reaching them fast. The cold was the particular, killing kind that the Colorado high country produced in November, the kind that did not merely make you shiver, but instead reached inside you and started methodically dismantling your thinking. Susanna had already lost feeling in the fingers of her left hand despite the thick gloves she wore, and her face, above the wool scarf she had wrapped around it, felt like something carved from wood rather than flesh. The saddlebag with the money in it felt heavier with every mile, though she knew that was only her exhaustion talking. She had robbed the Gunnison Merchants Bank that morning with two men, a pair of drifting brothers named Cleet and Roy Haddon, who were brave enough when things were going their way and completely useless the moment they weren't. The job had gone sideways almost immediately. The bank's owner had been armed, something their information had not accounted for, and there had been shots, and then Cleet had taken a graze across his shoulder and panicked, and suddenly everyone was running in different directions. Susanna had been the one to actually grab the money while the men argued, which was, she reflected, entirely typical. She had ridden north toward the mountains because north was where the sheriff's posse would least expect her to go in November, and because she had vague knowledge of a pass through the Sawatch Range that was said to be passable in early winter. That knowledge had turned out to be, at best, optimistic. She did not hear the cabin so much as feel it. Cinder suddenly stopped dead, planting all 4 feet and refusing to move, and when Susanna raised her arm against the wind to peer ahead, she saw the dark rectangle of a structure not 20 yards distant. It was low and solid, built from heavy logs, with a roof that the snow was beginning to pile deep upon. A thin thread of smoke came from the chimney and was immediately shredded to nothing by the wind, but the smoke meant heat, and heat meant survival, and Susanna Winslow had enough self-preservation instinct left in her to override everything else. She slid from the saddle, her legs nearly buckling when she hit the ground, caught herself against Cinder's flank, and led the horse toward what she could now make out as a small lean-to structure attached to the side of the cabin. There was a door on it, and she wrestled it open, and Cinder walked in with a gratitude so evident it was almost human. There was already a horse inside, a big dark bay, and it shifted and snorted but made no fuss as Cinder pressed close for warmth. Susanna found a hook on the wall and hung the saddlebag there out of habit more than strategy, then turned and fought her way to the cabin's front door. She raised her fist to knock. Then she stopped. She was a wanted woman. The man inside this cabin might have seen the wanted posters that circulated through the territory with her face on them, sketched in rough charcoal, listing her name and a reward that had climbed to $200 following a stage robbery outside of Pueblo the previous spring. She was also half frozen and entirely out of options, and so she decided she would worry about the wanted posters if and when she survived the night. She knocked. Nothing. She knocked again, harder with both fists, because her right hand was going numb now too. The door swung open. The man who filled the doorframe was, in the most immediate sense, enormous. Susanna Winslow was not a small woman. She stood 5 feet and 6 inches, which was taller than most women she knew and a fair number of men. But this man made her feel small in a way she was entirely unaccustomed to and did not particularly appreciate. He was well over 6 feet, with shoulders that seemed barely contained by the heavy wool shirt he wore, and his arms, visible below rolled-up sleeves despite the cold, were the kind of arms that were built not in pursuit of some aesthetic ideal, but through years of actual, demanding physical labor. His hands were enormous, scarred across the knuckles, and one of them held a rifle with the casual competence of a man who had lived his whole life in places where a rifle was simply a necessary extension of the self. His hair was dark brown, thick, and fell past his jaw in the manner of a man who had better things to do than visit a barber regularly, and his beard was full but trimmed close enough to show the strong line of his jaw. His eyes, visible above the rifle he had leveled at her, were a dark, watchful amber. He looked at her for a long moment without speaking. "I need to come inside," Susanna said. Her voice came out steadier than she expected, which was something she supposed she could credit to years of practice at not showing weakness. "I can see that," the man said. His voice was low and unhurried, the kind of voice that belonged to a person who had spent a great deal of time in silence and had made peace with it. He lowered the rifle, not fully, but enough that it was no longer pointed at her face. "You alone?" "Yes. Horse. In your lean-to. I hope that's all right. She would have died otherwise." Something shifted in his expression. Not exactly warmth, but perhaps the recognition of a reasonable decision made under pressure. He stepped back and opened the door wider, and Susanna walked inside. The cabin's interior hit her like walking into a different world. The heat from the fireplace in the far wall was enormous and immediate, and her body, which had been operating in a state of emergency for the past several hours, reacted to it with what she could only describe as desperation. Her knees shook. She stopped walking and stood just inside the doorway, dripping melt from her coat onto the swept plank floor, and tried to collect herself. "Sit," the man said, pulling a heavy chair close to the fire without making a production of it. It was not an order exactly, but it wasn't a request either. Susanna sat. He pulled the door closed behind them, and the howl of the storm became muffled, reduced to something that sounded like an argument happening in the next room rather than a catastrophe happening directly overhead. The fireplace threw orange light across the interior of the cabin, which was a single large room, tidily kept, with a workbench along one wall covered in tools and half-finished projects, a bed in the corner with a thick quilt folded on it, shelves stocked with preserved goods and ammunition, and a small iron stove in addition to the fireplace, which was currently doing double duty as both a heat source and a cooking apparatus, a pot of something hanging from the iron arm over the flames. The man crossed to a shelf and set the rifle down, then turned to look at her. "Nathan Carver," he said. "Susanna," she said, and stopped. She did not offer a last name. He studied her for a moment with those amber eyes, and she had the uncomfortable sensation that he was filing away the omission without making any visible judgment about it. "You came from the south," he said. It was not a question. "How do you know that? Winds from the northwest. You came in with snow on your right side, not your left. Trail south of here is the only one worth riding this time of year. Trail north is death in November." She absorbed this. "I was trying to reach the pass." "In November," he said flatly. "I was aware it was a risk. That pass has been closed since October. There's a foot of ice on it already." He pulled another chair to the fire, sat in it, and stretched out his long legs. He was watching her with an expression that was not hostile but was absolutely measuring. "You want to tell me what you're running from, or would you rather warm up first?" Susanna felt a flicker of something, not quite fear, because she had trained herself out of fear a long time ago, but something adjacent to it. Caution, maybe. Alertness. "What makes you think I'm running from something?" Woman rides alone into a November storm in the high country trying to get over a closed pass. She's either running from something or she's the most optimistic person in Colorado. He paused. "You don't look like the optimistic type." Despite everything, something very nearly like a smile tried to happen at the corner of her mouth. She killed it before it got there. "I'll take some of whatever is in that pot if you're offering." "I am," he said, and got up and filled a tin cup with the contents of the pot, which turned out to be a thick stew of venison and dried vegetables, and handed it to her without ceremony. She wrapped her nearly thawed fingers around the cup and held it there for a moment, just absorbing the warmth before she drank. It was good. Better than good, actually. The kind of food that was simple and honest and made with care, and the warmth of it moving down into her chest was something close to religious. Neither of them spoke for several minutes. The storm outside built toward what Susanna was beginning to understand was a full blizzard, the kind that could last days rather than hours. The wind made the shuttered windows flex and creak. A fine sifting of snow found its way through gaps in the logs and dusted the floor near the wall before the heat of the room could evaporate it. "There are wanted posters," Nathan Carver said. He said it quietly, without accusation, the way a person might mention an inconvenient weather forecast. "Circulated through Gunnison last month. Woman named Susanna Winslow, dark hair, rides alone, wanted for stage robbery and various associated troubles." He did not look at her as he said it. He was watching the fire. Susanna set the cup down on the hearth very carefully. Her hand had moved to the revolver at her hip before she was consciously aware of it, and she was watching him with the concentrated attention she reserved for situations that might require very fast decisions. He looked at her then and looked deliberately at the hand on her gun and looked back at her face. "I'm not going to bring you in," he said. "That's not what I do. But I'm not going to pretend I don't know who you are either. That's not what I do either." Susanna studied him for a long moment. In her experience, people generally fell into two categories: those who could be trusted and those who could not, and the reliable feature that distinguished the two was not what they said, but how they said it. Nathan Carver said things the way a man says things when lying simply does not occur to him as an available option. She moved her hand away from the gun. "All right," she said. "All right," he agreed, and turned back to the fire, and that was apparently all there was to say about it. The storm outside announced its intention to stay for a while. The wind shifted and built, and by the time full dark had settled over the mountain, there was no question of going anywhere for at least another day, possibly two. Nathan banked the fire for the night with the efficiency of a man who had performed this task 1,000 times, checked the shutters, and offered Susanna the bed in the corner without any particular fuss about it. "I'll take the floor," he said. "That's not necessary," she said. "I've slept on harder floors than this one," he said, and that was settled. She lay under the heavy quilt and stared at the low ceiling and listened to the storm and tried to sleep, and for a long time could not. She was used to sleeping light, in places where something might go wrong at any moment, and the unfamiliar sounds of another person in the room kept her alert in a way that was not exactly unpleasant but was strange. She could hear him breathing in the dark, slow and even, and the sound of it was oddly settling, like a clock ticking in a room you'd thought was empty. She fell asleep before she realized she was going to. Morning came with the storm still screaming and approximately 3 feet of new snow visible through the gap at the top of one shutter. And Nathan was already up and had the fire rebuilt and coffee boiling on the stove when Susanna woke. He handed her a cup of coffee without being asked, and she drank it standing by the fire in stocking feet, and the domesticity of the scene struck her as nearly surreal. She had not woken in someone else's home to coffee in a very long time. She had not woken anywhere she might have described as safe in longer than that. The pass will be completely inaccessible until spring, Nathan said. He was at the workbench, working on something with a draw knife, long smooth strokes along a curved piece of wood that was slowly revealing itself as the stave of a snowshoe. Understood, understood, she said. You can stay here until the storm breaks. After that, your choices are west toward Gunnison or north to the Taylor River country. Either direction, I can take you as far as the first settlement. She looked at him. Why would you do that? He kept his eyes on his work. Because the alternatives are you trying it alone and dying on a mountain, or you going back to Gunnison with whatever trouble is following you and very likely getting shot. A pause. Neither of those is particularly appealing to watch happen. Susanna felt something shift inside her, something small but distinct, the way ice cracks before it gives way. She pressed it back down because she was practiced at pressing things down and said, "What kind of mountain man offers hospitality to a wanted outlaw?" He set the draw knife down and looked at her then fully, and she found she had to work to hold the look. The kind who spent enough time up here to know that what a person is wanted for and who a person actually is aren't always the same thing, he said. And the kind who was raised to believe that turning a person away in a blizzard is about as low as a human being can go. Susanna said nothing. She turned back to the fire and held her coffee cup with both hands and made no acknowledgement of the way those words had moved through her. The second day snowed harder than the first. They were effectively sealed inside, the snow having drifted to cover the lower half of the door entirely, and Nathan had to go out through the linta to see to the horses, and returned with snowflakes in his dark hair and a dusting of white across the breadth of his shoulders. He shook himself off at the threshold and announced that Cinder was in fine shape and had made friends with his horse, whose name was Pike, and Susanna felt an irrational relief about this that she declined to examine closely. They talked, carefully at first, in the way of two people who are feeling their way across uncertain ground. Nathan asked her nothing direct about her past, and she volunteered nothing direct about it, but they found, almost by accident, a shared territory of conversation in books. He had a shelf of them along the back wall, perhaps 20 volumes, well-worn and clearly read more than once, and she had spotted the spine of a Dickens novel she had read in another life entirely, when she had been a girl in Missouri with a father who owned a store and a mother who had believed that reading was the most important thing a person could do. "You've read Dickens," she said. He looked over his shoulder from where he was working. "Bleak House. Twice. It's more or less the only book I have that takes longer than 3 days to get through. A brief, quiet thing that was almost a smile. The winters are long. It is a very long book," she agreed. "Have you read it? My mother had a copy. She made me read the first 100 pages when I was 12 and wouldn't let me have supper until I did." "Did it work?" She looked at the book on the shelf. "I've read it 4 times. He turned fully from the workbench at that, and the look he gave her was something she could not quite name. Interest, she might have called it. Not the interested look of a man calculating something, but the interested look of a man genuinely discovering something unexpected and finding the discovery worthwhile. "Tell me about your mother," he said. It was an unexpected question. She was not prepared for it, which meant she answered it before the part of her that screened and controlled her responses could intervene. "She was kind," she said. "She believed that people were basically decent, given the right conditions. She died when I was 16, of typhoid, and I have spent roughly the 8 years since then arguing with her memory about whether she was right." He nodded slowly and did not offer condolences in the practiced, hollow way she had learned to expect from people. He simply accepted what she had said and gave her the dignity of letting it sit there without immediately filling the space it had made. "Your father?" he asked, a moment later. "He remarried," she said. "A woman with opinions about what a girl should be and what she should want and what she should do with herself. I left when I was 17. She paused. "I haven't been what most people would call settled since then." "That takes courage," he said. "Or recklessness," she said. Sometimes those are the same thing, he said, and returned to his work and left her to think about that. The third day, the storm still had not broken, but it had diminished from murderous to merely brutal, and there was enough light seeping around the edges of the shutters to see by. Nathan unshuttered one window briefly to look at the sky, and the cold that poured in was immense, and the view was of an absolutely white world from horizon to horizon, the pine trees below laden with snow and motionless in the temporary lull, the peaks above lost entirely in cloud. 2 more days, maybe 3, he said, closing the shutter. The barometer is dropping again. You have a barometer. He nodded toward the shelf, where Susanna now noticed a small brass instrument hanging on a nail. Man lives alone on a mountain. The weather is about the most important news there is. I've had that since I came up here. How long have you been up here? She asked. He thought about it. 7 years, came up from Texas after the war work dried up. I was a scout for a while, then did some surveying for the railroad, then decided I'd rather live somewhere the railroad wasn't going to reach. Do you miss it? Down below, I mean people, towns. He was quiet for a moment. Some days, he said honestly, but not the way you think. I don't miss the noise of it. I miss he paused, seeming to search for the word. The company, the kind that isn't performing something. Up here it's just what things are. When someone says something to you, it's because they mean it, not because there's an audience. Susanna looked at him. That's an interesting way to see it. You disagree? I think most people would say loneliness is loneliness, regardless of what's causing it. Are you lonely? He asked. The question arrived without warning, and lodged in her chest like a thrown stone, finding still water. She looked away from him and did not answer immediately, and the fire crackled and popped and filled the silence between them, and she became aware that the honest answer to his question was something she had been avoiding for a very long time. Yes, she said at last. She said it very quietly, as though hoping the word would not make it past the fireplace and be officially registered as having been spoken. Nathan Carver looked at her steadily. He did not say "I thought so," or "I understand," or anything designed to fill the space she had just opened. He simply nodded once, and his expression held something that was entirely genuine, not pity, which she would have despised, but recognition, the look of someone acknowledging a truth they had encountered themselves. I know something about that, he said, just as quietly. On the third night, she asked him about the scar that ran along his left forearm, visible when he rolled his sleeve to wash up before eating. He looked at it with the detached interest of a man who has long since made peace with his own history, and told her about a bear trap set by a careless trapper north of the Taylor River, 3 winters prior, which he had stepped into while tracking a wounded elk. He had been alone, 3 miles from the cabin, and had worked himself free and walked home, and the cold had both slowed the bleeding enough to save his life and made the wound worse than it needed to be, and by the time he'd reached the cabin he had been in a bad enough way that he still didn't entirely know how he'd managed to treat it himself. You could have died, she said. Could have, he agreed, serving out 2 plates of the salt pork and beans he'd been cooking. That's the bargain up here. More freedom than most people can imagine, and the freedom to die from your own mistakes just as easily. That is the most honest description of being an outlaw I have ever heard, she said, and you were describing living on a mountain. He looked at her and she looked at him, and for the first time since she had appeared half frozen in his doorway, something broke in her that was genuine and unguarded. She laughed. Not a polite social laugh, but a real one, surprised out of her, and the sound of it seemed to startle them both. His face changed when she laughed, and she caught it, the way something in him softened and brightened simultaneously, the way the serious, watchful expression gave way to something warmer and more open, and she looked quickly back down at her plate because she was not ready to look at that expression directly. Nathan Carver looked at his own plate and said nothing, but the corner of his mouth was doing something that it hadn't done before. By the 4th day, the storm had settled into a steady, quieter snowfall, the blizzard's rage spent but its mass still accumulating, and the mountains lay under a silence so complete that it had its own texture. Susanna had by now thoroughly explored every object and book and tool in the cabin, had helped prepare all 3 meals, had swept the floor twice out of restlessness, had split kindling for the fire from the indoor wood supply because she needed to do something with her hands, and had spent approximately 16 hours total thinking about Nathan Carver without being willing to admit to herself that that was what she was doing. He was, she thought, the most straightforward person she had ever met. Not simple, that was the wrong word entirely. He was deeply thoughtful. She was beginning to understand the way a person is thoughtful who has had a great deal of time to think. But he had stripped away whatever social performance the rest of the world demanded and had arrived at something that was just himself, direct and unadorned. And the effect of this on Susanna was deeply, uncomfortably disorienting. She was a woman whose entire survival had depended on reading people quickly and accurately, on knowing within 30 seconds who was going to be a problem, who could be charmed, who could be bluffed, who was genuinely dangerous. Nathan Carver resisted every category she tried to put him in. He wasn't a threat and he wasn't a pushover. He wasn't trying to impress her and he wasn't dismissing her. He was simply there, occupying space with a kind of uncomplicated solidity that she found both restful and deeply unsettling, in the way that things are unsettling when they offer you something you hadn't known you wanted. On the 4th afternoon, he suggested she try the snowshoes he'd finished making, for the purpose of checking on the horses and taking a look at what the snow had done to the trail south. She had never worn snowshoes before and said so. He looked at her as though this were a minor problem easily solved, and spent 20 minutes teaching her on the packed snow outside the cabin door, his hands patient and impersonal as he adjusted the bindings, his voice even and clear as he explained the walking gait wider than normal, placing your feet deliberately, trusting the surface. She fell twice. The second time, she went down sideways into a drift and came up with snow in her collar and her hat at a precarious angle and quite a lot of her dignity missing, and he reached down and offered his hand to pull her out, and she took it, and for a moment they stood close in the cold air. His large hand closed around hers, and she saw the thing in his face again, the thing she had been avoiding looking at directly. She pulled her hand back and said, "I have the idea of it now," and turned toward the lean-to, and felt his gaze on her back and felt the cold air on her face and felt, beneath all of it, something warm and persistent that she could not talk herself out of. That evening, while Nathan was feeding the horses, Susanna sat alone in the firelight with the saddlebag on her lap and counted the stolen money. $3,240, which was more money than most working people in Colorado would see in 5 years. She had stolen it. She could not unsteal it. The 2 men she had stolen it with had, as far as she knew, escaped the law and would now be expecting their share, if and when she ever encountered them again, which she was currently hoping never to do. She sat with the money in her lap and the firelight on her face and thought about what she was doing with her life, which was a line of inquiry she had been successfully avoiding for 8 years and which was suddenly, in the enforced stillness of this snowbound cabin, refusing to be avoided anymore. The door opened. Nathan came in on a gust of cold air, stomped the snow from his boots, hung his coat. He saw her with the saddlebag, and for a moment neither of them said anything. "I know what I am," she said before he could speak. "I am not asking you to pretend otherwise." "I wasn't going to," he said quietly. He came and sat in the chair across from her and looked at the saddlebag and then at her face. "What are you going to do with it?" "I don't know," she said. She said it with a plainness that surprised her because she was used to always having an answer, a plan, a story ready. "That is the honest truth, I don't know." He was quiet for a moment. "How did you get here?" he said. "Not tonight, I mean, how did you get to be who you are?" It was a question she had never been asked directly. People who knew what she was assumed the answer was obvious, or didn't care about the answer, or were afraid of the answer. People who didn't know what she was had never had occasion to ask. She looked at the fire for a long time, and Nathan Carver waited with the same unhurried patience he seemed to bring to everything. And she found, slowly and somewhat against her will, that she was talking. She told him about leaving her father's house in Missouri at 17 with $12 and a horse that wasn't entirely hers, heading west because west was the direction that meant something other than what you were. She told him about the first 2 years, which had been lean and difficult and frightening in ways she had never admitted to anyone. The constant calculation of how to survive in a world that had very specific and narrow ideas about what a woman traveling alone should be. She told him about meeting a man named Cooper in Abilene who had recognized something in her, and offered her a place in a small operation that was mostly card sharping but occasionally tilted toward the more dramatically illegal, and how she had taken it because the alternative had been worse, and how she had been good at it, better than Cooper had expected. Good enough that by the time she had understood the full extent of what she was doing, she was already in deep enough that the way out looked harder than continuing. She told him about the stage robbery outside of Pueblo, which was the first one she had planned herself, which she had done partly because she was tired of splitting things unequally, and partly because by then she had lost the habit of imagining an alternative. She told him about the 2 years since, the drifting and the jobs and the mounting wanted posters, and the way that after enough time, a life that you had stumbled into started to feel like something you had chosen, and the difference between those two things became harder and harder to see. She stopped talking. The fire had burned low while she was speaking, and the cabin was dimmer than it had been. Nathan had not moved or spoken during any of it. He was leaning forward with his elbows on his knees and his hands clasped together, and he was looking at the fire with an expression she could not read from her angle. "Say something," she said, which was not a thing she generally said to people. He looked at her. "I think you are a great deal more than the sum of what you've done," he said, "and I think you know that, and I think that knowing it is the most painful part." Susanna Winslow, who had not cried in front of another person since she was 16 years old and her mother was being buried in a Missouri churchyard, felt something rise in her throat that she had to swallow very deliberately and carefully and twice. She looked at the fire and did not say anything at all for quite a long time. "You're a strange man, Nathan Carver," she said finally. "I've been called worse," he said, and his voice had warmth in it, and she made the mistake of looking at him when he said it, and the expression on his face in the firelight was something she was going to have to think about for a long time. The storm broke on the morning of the 5th day. Susanna woke to sunlight coming around the shutters with a brilliance that seemed almost aggressive after the gray days preceding it, and she could hear, for the first time, the difference in the wind. It had moved from shrieking to sighing, and the sighing was already dying away to something almost calm. She lay in the bed for a moment and thought, "Today he will offer to take me to the nearest settlement and I will accept, because that is what needs to happen, and I am not a person who invites trouble by staying where she should not stay." She got up. She dressed. She went to the fire, which Nathan had already built up, and found that Nathan was not in the cabin. She looked out through the shutter gap he had cleared and saw him outside, shoveling a path from the cabin door to the lean-to, working with the steady, unhurried efficiency she had come to associate with everything he did, his breath fogging in the cold air, his dark hair loose around his face. He had his coat off despite the temperature, working in his heavy shirt, and the breadth of him moving against the white world outside was something she noticed against her better judgment and stood watching for somewhat longer than was entirely necessary. She made coffee. When he came in, stamping snow from his boots, she handed him a cup without being asked, and he looked at it and then at her and said, "Thank you." And there was something in the way he said it that was not about the coffee. They ate breakfast and talked about the route south, about the condition of the trail, about what Susanna would do when she reached the next settlement, which was a question she gave careful and somewhat evasive answers to, because she had not yet worked out what she would do. The money in the saddlebag was a problem that had not resolved itself overnight. The two Haddon brothers were a problem she could not predict. The law was a problem she had been managing with varying degrees of success for 2 years and saw no immediate improvement in. But there was another problem, one she had not anticipated when she rode into the teeth of a blizzard 5 days ago, which was Nathan Carver himself. The way he looked at her, the way he talked to her, the way she felt in his company, which was a way she had not felt in any company she could remember. Steady. Seen. Something close to herself. "You said you miss company," she said as they were finishing breakfast. "The right kind." He looked at her carefully. "I did." "Does that mean you want people around, or that you want them to visit and then leave, or—" She stopped. She was not accustomed to asking questions this close to the actual thing she wanted to know. "It means," he said, slowly and very deliberately, "that I would like the right person to be in this cabin, and I have not found that, and I had made something of a peace with the idea that I might not." And then a woman showed up half frozen in a blizzard with $3,000 and a very interesting history, and I find that my peace with the idea is somewhat less settled than it was. Susanna set down her coffee cup. She looked at him across the small table with the fire going behind him and the sunlight coming in from the cleared shutter, and turning the whole interior golden and warm. And she thought about 8 years of motion and calculation and loneliness wrapped in the disguise of freedom. And she thought about her mother, who had believed people were basically decent given the right conditions. And she thought about the fact that she had slept without waking in this cabin 5 nights running, which was more consecutive undisturbed sleep than she had had in years. "I told you I am a wanted woman," she said. "You did. I told you I am not a settled person. You did. I told you I have done things that are difficult to justify." "Yes." "Nathan," she said, and saying his name directly felt like a decision. "What exactly are you suggesting?" He was quiet for a moment, and in the quiet she could hear the snow settling on the roof, a soft percussive weight shifting and adjusting, and somewhere outside a jay was making the harsh particular sound jays make when the world has become quiet enough to bother. "I'm not suggesting you stay out of obligation," he said. "I'm not suggesting it because you have nowhere else to go. I'm suggesting that in 5 days I have had more conversations that meant something than in the previous year, and that you are the most remarkable person who has sat at that table, and that if you ride south today and I never see you again, that will be its own kind of blizzard." He paused. "I am suggesting that you might consider staying, not forever if that's too much, but for long enough to see whether what I think is happening between us is actually happening." Susanna looked at him for a long time. He met the look without flinching, without performing confidence he didn't feel, just looking back at her with the honest, steady attention that she had been trying and failing to armor herself against for 5 days. She said, "I have a great deal of problems, Nathan Carver." "I know," he said. "The money has to go back," she said, and felt the words arrive in the room with a weight and finality she hadn't entirely intended. She sat with them for a moment and found that she meant them, which was both alarming and, in some deep part of her, a relief that she had not been expecting. "Not to the law, maybe. Not in a way that puts me in front of a judge. But it can't stay here. It can't be spent." "It wasn't mine," Nathan nodded slowly. "I know a man in Gunnison, a judge. He is not the kind of man who is inflexible about methods, only about outcomes. There are ways to make things right that don't always follow a straight line." She looked at him. "You would do that, help me find a way, if you let me." She was quiet for a long time, and the fire crackled, and the sunlight moved on the floor, and she turned over in her hands everything she had been and everything she might be. And she thought about her mother, who was right, who had always been right, about people being decent given the right conditions. And she thought that Nathan Carver was the right conditions in a way she had never encountered before and might never encounter again. "All right," she said. And then, because she was Susanna Winslow and she did not do things by halves, "And yes, I'll stay, for long enough." The look on his face was something she kept close for a long time after, something private that she did not analyze but simply held onto, and she thought she would probably keep holding onto it for a very long time. What followed was not simple, because nothing in life that is real is simple. But it was, despite everything, possible. The return to Gunnison took 3 days once the trail was manageable, the two of them riding side by side on Cinder, and pike through a world that had been remade in white and silence and crystalline winter light. They did not talk constantly. There were long stretches of just riding, of the sound of hooves on packed snow and the creak of saddle leather and the cold air. And Susanna found that being quiet beside Nathan Carver was as easy as talking to him, which was its own kind of thing she had not been expecting. He rode with the relaxed alertness of a man who had spent years in wild country, always watching the tree line without appearing to, always noting the way the trail bent and what lay beyond the bend, his rifle across his saddle in the easy way that was neither threatening nor careless. He rode between her and the tree line on the exposed stretches, which she noticed and said nothing about, because the gesture was so simple and unself-conscious that to comment on it would have been to make it something different than it was. She told him more about her life as they rode in pieces, the way you tell things when you are side by side, and looking at the same horizon rather than at each other. She told him about the stage coach outside of Pueblo and how she had felt afterward, which was not triumphant the way she had expected, but rather cold and slightly sick, and how she had filed that feeling away and not looked at it because looking at it would have required her to change. She told him about the Haddon brothers, who were not, she said, evil men, just careless ones, which in her experience was more dangerous than evil because evil at least had a consistent logic to it. She told him about the bank in Gunnison, which she had known going in was a mistake, and she had done it anyway because she had run out of better ideas and the Haddon brothers had insisted. Nathan listened to all of it with the same quality of attention he brought to everything, and occasionally asked a question that went to the center of things with a directness that was not unkind, and she found that telling the truth about herself, laid out in full, was both more frightening and considerably more lightening than she had anticipated. The man in Gunnison that Nathan had mentioned was Judge Harlan Bates, who turned out to be a compact, white-haired man of approximately 60, with eyes like chips of gray flint, and a manner suggesting he had heard every variety of human trouble and sorted them into manageable categories long ago. Nathan had met him years ago through a mutual acquaintance in the surveying business, and there was between them the straightforward mutual respect of men who have found each other trustworthy in inconvenient circumstances. Susanna sat in the judge's cold, cluttered office above a hardware store on Gunnison's Main Street and told him what she had told Nathan, looking him in the eye the whole time, and set the saddlebag on the desk between them. Harlan Bates looked at the saddlebag. He looked at Susanna. He looked at Nathan, who was standing against the wall with his arms folded, saying nothing, and then back at Susanna. "The Merchants' Bank is owned by a man named Elias Croft," Bates said, "who is, I'm happy to say, a personal and profound rascal who has defrauded more homesteaders and ranchers in this valley than I have managed to bring to account in 12 years of trying. He has also, as of this morning, filed a claim of robbery in excess of $2,000, having apparently estimated low." He picked up the saddlebag, opened it, and looked inside. "The full amount of the theft, returned anonymously, will resolve the legal complaint. Mr. Croft is not a man who will pursue justice at additional personal expense once his money has been recovered. The wanted poster concerning a Susanna Winslow is 2 months old and was circulated from a description given by the same Elias Croft, who is not, to put it charitably, the most careful observer of detail. I see no woman in this office who matches the description he provided." He closed the saddlebag and set it aside. "The 2 gentlemen named Haddon are, as of last week, guests of the territorial jail in Pueblo on an unrelated matter," he continued. They are unlikely to be in a position to discuss their former associates' whereabouts, as doing so would require explaining their own. Is there anything else I need to know? Susanna looked at him. The stage robbery outside of Pueblo, she said. Bates looked at her steadily. Was there an accompanying description? I believe so. Then it will require some time and some care. There is a process by which persons who provide material assistance to the resolution of outstanding crimes, as you have just done with this money, may be treated with consideration. It is not amnesty, but it is something short of a noose. He paused. I have, over the years, found that people are capable of becoming more than their worst decisions. I prefer to operate on that assumption until proven otherwise. Another pause. Nathan clearly thinks well of you, and Nathan is not a fool. Susanna looked at Nathan, who was looking at the wall with the expression of a man who is pretending not to be listening very carefully. No, she said, he is not. The process that Judge Bates had described took several months and required several trips from the mountain to Gunnison, which Susanna made with Nathan on the easier winter trail that the judge had pointed out, a longer route but a safer one. And by the end of February, the worst of the outstanding warrants had been, in Bates's careful legal phrasing, addressed to the satisfaction of the interested parties. And there existed a formal record showing a material contribution to the return of stolen goods that could be cited in any subsequent proceedings. It was not a clean slate. Susanna did not pretend it was. But it was solid ground, which was more than she had been standing on in 8 years. She had been living in the cabin since January, which had happened the way things sometimes happen between two people who are both too honest to pretend they don't want what they want while being too careful to name it before they are sure of it. After the trip to Gunnison and back, with the blizzard past and the money gone and the worst of the legal weight beginning to lift, there had been a day when she had begun to pack her things and Nathan had watched her from across the room with an expression that had made her stop, and she had looked at him and he had said simply, "You don't have to go," and she had said, "I know," and set the bag down, and neither of them had made a production of what that meant. What it meant, in the day-to-day reality of it, was that she learned to snowshoe without falling, and she learned to set snares for rabbits in the white mornings, and she discovered that she was actually considerably more capable outdoors than she had given herself credit for, having spent most of her adult life in towns. She helped Nathan with the cabin's winter maintenance, learned the rhythms of the wood supply and the water and the animal care, and found that the physical work of keeping a mountain life running was something she was genuinely good at, and that the goodness of it, the clean fatigue of effort with tangible results, was deeply satisfying in a way that nothing she had done in 8 years had been. Nathan taught her things with the particular patience of a person who teaches because he genuinely wants the other person to know, not to demonstrate his own knowledge. He taught her to read weather signs in the sky and the way the animals moved and the quality of the wind on your face. He taught her to shoot more accurately because her aim had been serviceable before but not reliable, and he was the kind of teacher who corrected without condescension. He taught her which plants would come up in spring and which were edible, and he told her the names of the mountains they could see from the high meadow above the cabin on clear days, and those names had the sound of things he was personally fond of, the way a person says the names of old friends. She taught him, in return, things he did not have. She taught him to play cards with the full repertoire of tricks she had accumulated over years of gaming, which he found both appalling and genuinely interesting. She taught him 3 card games he had not known, and regularly beat him at all of them until he had played enough to make it a real contest, which took approximately 6 weeks and produced some of the most enjoyable evenings she had spent in recent memory. She read to him from Bleak House in the evenings by firelight, taking turns, because he admitted he had always wanted to read it aloud but had no one to read it with, and the Dickens became a kind of vocabulary between them, so that she might look at him when something absurd happened and say, "Mr. Jarndyce would have something to say about this," and he would laugh, which was still a thing she took particular satisfaction in producing. She was in the high meadow one afternoon in late February, on her own, snowshoeing just for the pleasure of it, when she stopped at the overlook that Nathan had showed her early on a flat shelf of rock above the tree line from which the entire valley below was visible, spread out under snow in the afternoon light like something from a painting, the river a dark thread through white, the distant smoke of Gunnison just visible, and she stood there in the cold and quiet and thought, with a clarity and simplicity that startled her, that she was happy, not relieved, not temporarily comfortable. Happy, the kind that comes from recognizing the place you are standing as somewhere you belong. She went back to the cabin and found Nathan at the workbench and sat down across from him and said, with no preamble, "I am not going to leave." He looked up from his work. He studied her face for a moment with those amber eyes, reading what was there with the attention he brought to everything important. "Good," he said, just that word. "Good. And then, as though the most obvious thing in the world, I was hoping you'd say that." She looked at him, and the warmth she had been carrying around inside her for months broke through the careful, habitual containment she had kept around it, and she said, "Nathan, if I tell you something, do you promise not to make it into more than it needs to be?" "No," he said simply, "I won't promise that." She laughed, which was still, she thought, one of the best things she had recently discovered about herself, that she laughed easily in this cabin with this man in a way that felt like breathing rather than performance. "All right," she said, "then I'll say it without the promise. I love you. I have been loving you since approximately the second day of the blizzard, which I am aware is very fast, but I have found that I am not particularly capable of being dishonest with you, and so there it is." Nathan set down his tools. He stood up from the workbench, and he crossed the cabin in 2 long strides, and he took her face in both his big, warm, scarred hands, and he looked at her with an expression that was so unguarded and so full that she had to hold her breath for a moment. "I have been in love with you," he said, "since you stood half frozen in my doorway and told me you were aware it was a risk, and there was so much of you in those 6 words that I thought I would fall over." He was very close. His thumbs moved across her cheekbones in a gesture, so gentle it seemed impossible from hands that large. "Susanna Winslow, you are the best thing this mountain has ever given me, and I intend to spend a considerable amount of time making sure you know it." She kissed him. She had kissed people before in her life, but not like this, not with the whole weight of herself behind it and nothing held back, not with the specific profound relief of doing the exact right thing after a very long time of doing the wrong ones. He kissed her back. His arms came around her, and she was enclosed in a warmth and solidity that felt, she thought, like arriving somewhere after an extremely long journey. Spring arrived on the mountain in the slow, incremental way of high country spring, which is less a season and more a series of daily negotiations with winter, warmth gaining ground and losing it and gaining more, until one morning the snow is gone from the south-facing slope, and the first green is showing through the wet dark earth, and the sound of water running free replaces the compressed silence of the frozen months. Susanna had never paid particular attention to seasons before, having always been in motion. She paid attention to this one. She watched the mountain wake up with the absorbed interest of someone who understood, for the first time, that she would see it happen again next year and the year after that the watching was cumulative, that knowing a place across time was a different thing entirely from passing through it. She and Nathan were married in May, in Gunnison, in a simple ceremony before Judge Bates, who performed it with the same dry efficiency he brought to legal proceedings, but with a warmth she had not seen from him before, a genuine pleasure in the occasion that he tried briefly to conceal, and then appeared to decide was not worth the effort. Nathan wore his good coat, which turned out to be a dark wool thing that fit the breadth of his shoulders remarkably well, and his hair was tied back, and he looked at her when she walked in the door of the small courthouse with an expression that made the judge clear his throat and look somewhere else to give them a moment. She wore a dress she had bought with her own money, honestly earned, which was something she had decided mattered to her, the distinction between what was hers because she had worked for it and what had been taken. The dress was dark blue wool, simple and practical, and she had put a small spray of early wildflowers from the meadow above the cabin into her braided hair, because she had picked them herself that morning and they were beautiful and she had concluded, allowed to have beautiful things. Nathan held her hands during the vows and looked at her face the entire time, not at the judge, not at the window, at her. And when Bates said, "You may kiss your bride," the kiss was brief and true, and there was a sound from the back of the room, which turned out to be Bates's clerk, a 17-year-old boy named Joseph who had been sent to witness the proceedings, and who appeared to find the whole thing unexpectedly affecting. They went back to the mountain that afternoon, the same trail they had ridden in the blizzard, now green and alive, and dappled with light through the pines. And Cinder moved with the easy pleasure of a horse who knows the way home, and Nathan rode beside her with their hands occasionally brushing and sometimes finding each other across the space between their horses. The mountain in summer was a different world from the mountain in winter, wider, louder, full of life and color, and the particular busyness of every living thing making the most of the short season. Susanna became, over the summer months, genuinely skilled at the tasks the mountain demanded, not just capable but good, and the satisfaction of this was something she held close. She was particularly good with the horses, which Nathan said he had suspected from the beginning, and she took over most of their care with a thoroughness that Pike, Nathan's bay, warmed to surprisingly fast for a horse that had previously been fairly selective about his human company. She wrote a letter to her father in Missouri that summer. She spent 3 days composing it in her head before she sat down to write it, and it was a careful letter, honest about what she had done and where she had been and what she was now. And she did not ask forgiveness because she had decided that was a transaction she was not sure either of them could afford. But she told him she was alive and well and married and living on a mountain in Colorado, and that she thought of her mother often, and that she hoped he was at peace. She sent it with the next mail rider out of Gunnison and did not expect a response. She received one 3 months later, a brief letter in her father's handwriting, which she had not seen in 7 years, and which she recognized immediately, and which produced a feeling she had not been entirely prepared for. The letter was short and awkward in the way of letters from people who are not practiced at saying important things, but it said that he was glad she was alive, and that he was sorry for the years that had passed, and that he hoped she was happy. And when she read that last line, she sat very still at the table for a long moment. Nathan was outside when she read it. When he came in, she held the letter up without a word, and he read it and set it down and sat beside her and put his arm around her, and she leaned into the solid warmth of him and felt the specific particular piece of something old and broken beginning, very slowly, to be repaired. In the autumn of that year, when the aspens had turned the hillsides gold and the air had taken on the crystalline bite that preceded the first snow, Susanna discovered that she was expecting a child. She told Nathan in the evening, sitting by the fire, having spent the better part of the day working up to it, and then deciding that the working up was unnecessary because this was Nathan and unnecessary things were not required. She told him straight out, watching his face, and the sequence of expressions that moved across it in the first few seconds was something she would remember for the rest of her life. The moment of complete stillness, the rapid internal processing, and then the emergence of something so pure and open that it seemed almost to illuminate the room. He got up from his chair and sat beside her and took her into his arms with enormous care, as though she had become suddenly precious in a new and specific way, and held her there for a long time without speaking. "Are you all right?" he said against her hair. "Yes," she said. "Are you?" She felt rather than saw his face change. "I am better than all right," he said. "I am." He paused. "I cannot find the word for what I am." "I think I know," she said. They spent the evening talking about it with the thoroughness that characterized how they approached everything important, discussing practicalities and possibilities, and all the questions that a new life arriving in a mountain cabin in winter raises. And Nathan's calm and thoroughness were a steadiness she built herself upon, and his warmth was something she settled into. And by the time they went asleep, she felt not afraid but full of something that was both particular and limitless. The winter that followed was the hardest physical work Susanna had ever done, and also the most content she had ever been, which she thought was not exactly a contradiction. Nathan was attentive without being smothering, which she had been privately afraid of because she was not a person who tolerated smothering well. But Nathan understood her well enough to know that what she needed was someone beside her rather than someone hovering over her, and he was exactly that. The baby came in the late spring of the following year, in the cabin, with a doctor from Gunnison who had ridden up 2 days early to ensure he was there in time, and who turned out to be a steady, competent man named Dr. Aldous Reed, who had delivered more mountain babies than he could count, and who treated the whole process with a calm matter-of-factness that Susanna found enormously reassuring. Their son was born on a morning when the snow was gone from all but the highest peaks, and the meadow above the cabin was coming into its first pale green, and he arrived with a full-throated, emphatic cry that Nathan, waiting outside the door as Reed had directed, heard clearly through the log walls and which produced in him, Susanna later learned from a somewhat abashed admission, the very genuine physical sensation of his legs going weak. They named him Daniel Winslow Carver, because Susanna's mother's maiden name had been Winslow before she married, and because carrying her mother's name forward in this particular life felt like the kind of honoring that her mother, who had believed in people being decent given the right conditions, would have understood and approved of. Daniel was, from the beginning, a person of very definite opinions, which no one in the cabin found surprising. He had his mother's dark hair and his father's amber eyes, which combination produced a face of such immediate expressiveness that Dr. Reed remarked, before he rode back down the mountain, that this was the most communicative newborn he had seen in 30 years of practice, and he meant it as the compliment it was. Nathan held his son with the same careful, enormous gentleness with which he had held everything he cared for, and the expression on his face looking down at Daniel in those first days was something Susanna had never seen from him before, something beyond the full, open warmth she had come to know in him, something that had no name she knew, but that she recognized as belonging to the specific experience of a person, encountering the thing they were put on this earth to feel. She watched them together, Nathan talking to Daniel in his low, unhurried voice while he worked around the cabin, narrating the day and explaining the tools and describing the mountains visible through the window with the same patient thoroughness he brought to teaching her things, as though Daniel at 3 weeks old was a perfectly reasonable person to have a genuine conversation with, and she thought, not for the first time and not for the last, about the circuitous and improbable route by which she had arrived at this point, and the blizzard that had forced her through a stranger's door, and everything that had followed, and she thought that her mother had been right and she was glad. The summer Daniel was 1 year old, Susanna began something she had been turning over in her mind for some months, which was that she had a very particular and detailed knowledge of certain criminal methods and patterns that might, applied differently, be genuinely useful. She raised the idea with Nathan one evening with some caution, because she was not entirely sure how he would receive it, and found she need not have worried. She began to correspond with Judge Bates, and through Bates, with a deputy marshal named Tom Calder who operated out of the Gunnison district, and she provided in careful written detail a great deal of information about the routes and methods and associated people that she had known from her years in the territory. She gave names, locations, timing, the particular habits of operations she had been part of, and others she had known about. It was not informing in the self-serving sense. She was not trading information for benefit. She was providing, to the best of her ability, a kind of reckoning. And if the reckoning helped prevent other people from being robbed on stages and in banks, and if it helped close some of the open accounts the law had against people she had once ridden with, and who had long since proven themselves to be of the careless, dangerous variety, then that was something she could live with as a form of repair. Bates wrote back to say that her information had been, in 3 separate instances, of material assistance to operations that had prevented harm, and that his opinion of her, already favorable, had been elevated accordingly. She kept all of Bates's letters in a small wooden box that Nathan had made for her, a beautiful piece of work, jointed and smoothed and stained with walnut oil, with a small carved bird on the lid that was so precise and particular she had looked at it for a long time when he first gave it to her. "That's a meadowlark," she had said. "It is," he had said. "That's the bird that was in the meadow the morning I found out about Daniel," she said. "Yes," he said. "I know." She had looked at him and felt the full weight of being known, of having someone attend to the details of your life with genuine love, and the feeling was not diminished by familiarity. It was not a feeling you became accustomed to in the way that made it ordinary. It remained, each time, a kind of gift. 3 years after Daniel was born, their daughter arrived, a summer child, with Nathan's dark hair and Susanna's eyes, which were a particular dark gray-green, and she came into the world quietly and immediately looked around with an expression of focused assessment that was so recognizably her mother's that the doctor, who was Reed again, said, "Well, hello," to her, as though meeting a grown person. They named her Clara, after a character in a novel, which Nathan had suggested with the particular seriousness he brought to things that were actually something he cared about, and which Susanna had agreed to immediately because she liked the name, and because the novel in question was one they had read aloud together in the long winter evenings. Clara was, from the first, a person who observed everything with great thoroughness before reaching a conclusion, which made her, at age 2, the most reliable reporter of what was happening in any given situation in the cabin, and which made Nathan laugh with a warmth and delight that Susanna thought was one of the most beautiful sounds she had ever heard. The years turned. They were not, by any measure, easy years, because a life on a mountain in Colorado in the late 19th century was a physically demanding and occasionally genuinely dangerous life, and there were hard winters and one spring when the melt came fast, and the lower trail flooded and they were cut off from Gunnison for 3 weeks, and there was an autumn when Cinder came up lame, and the anxiety of it was disproportionate to what a reasonable person might expect from a horse going lame. But Cinder was not just a horse to Susanna, and they both knew it, and Nathan sat up 2 nights running monitoring her recovery with the same focused care he brought to everything he was determined to keep. Cinder recovered. She was 17 by that point and would only be ridden lightly, and she spent most of her days in the meadow, which she appeared to find a perfectly agreeable arrangement. Daniel at 5 was a person of immense energy and absolute conviction about everything, and at 7 he was helping Nathan with the trap lines, and at 9 he could set a snare and track a deer and read a weather sign, and he could also read anything printed in English at a speed and comprehension that his parents agreed was worth pursuing beyond what the mountain could provide. Nathan taught him mathematics with the rigor of a man who had learned field surveying and therefore had a profound respect for the subject, and Susanna taught him everything else she knew, which was considerable, and she wrote to her father in Missouri, who had over the years become a regular correspondent. And his reply to the letter about Daniel's education included the surprising information that he had started a small school on the edge of his land 20 years ago, and that he would be very pleased to help. This was the beginning of a period during which Susanna and her father rebuilt, slowly and with great care and many words, something that was not exactly what they had had before but was its own thing, genuine and earned. And when Daniel was 11, they made the journey to Missouri, the whole family, Nathan and Susanna and Daniel and Clara, and Susanna stood in the dooryard of the house she had left at 17 and looked at the man who had come out to meet them, who was older and quieter, and who looked at her with an expression that contained everything he did not know how to say. She walked to him and he put his arms around her and she stood there and let it be what it was. And beside her she heard Daniel ask Clara in a whisper what was happening, and Clara said, in her clear, observant way, "Mama is being brave," which was such a precise description that Susanna laughed through whatever else she was feeling, and the laugh broke the silence and her father said, "You have a remarkable family," and she said, "Yes, I do." Nathan shook her father's hand, and her father, who was not a man who formed opinions quickly, looked at Nathan for a long moment and then nodded once, the nod that Susanna had come to understand, over years of watching Nathan interact with people, meant that a thing had been established between two people that did not require additional ceremony. They stayed 2 weeks in Missouri, which was 2 weeks of Daniel and Clara meeting family they had not known they had, and of long evenings on a porch that Susanna remembered from childhood, now changed and the same, and of conversations between Susanna and her father that moved slowly and carefully through difficult terrain and emerged, not whole but better, into something workable and warm. When they rode back toward Colorado, Nathan said nothing for the first several miles, and then said, "I'm glad we came." And she said, "So am I." And Clara was asleep against Nathan's chest, wrapped in his coat, and Daniel was riding Cinder ahead on the trail because Susanna had decided that Cinder's retirement could accommodate the occasional small, gentle rider, and the late summer sky was enormous and blue. And she thought about a woman on a lame horse in a November blizzard, and the door that had opened in it. She had once been a person who moved continuously and trusted no one and held herself so tightly together that nothing could get in or get out. And she had done this because she had believed, without ever quite examining the belief, that holding still meant being caught and letting someone in meant being destroyed, and she had been wrong about both. The blizzard had stopped her. The cabin had held her. The man in the cabin had waited, with his amber eyes and his enormous hands and his patient, direct, unhurried way of being himself, for her to be ready to let something true happen. She was grateful in a way that had no bottom for all of it, for the storm. The cabin stood for many years, extended and improved over time. A real bedroom added when the children needed their own space, a proper kitchen structure, a larger barn for the horses when Pike and Cinder were eventually joined by 2 more. Nathan built a workshop addition where he could work through the winters with better light, and Susanna put bookshelves in the main room that eventually held nearly 100 volumes, accumulated over years of careful selection, the kind of library that a person builds who believes books are worth carrying. Bleak House sat on the end of the top shelf, both the original copy and a second one they had bought in Gunnison, because the original had been read so many times that the binding had begun to give way, and they read from it still, occasionally in the evenings, and the sound of Dickens in the firelight was something so associated with warmth and home, and the best of what their life was that it had become its own kind of language between them. On the evening of their 10th anniversary, Nathan made dinner with the same focused attention he brought to anything that mattered to him, and afterward they sat on the bench outside the cabin door in the late May warmth, the children asleep inside, and looked out at the mountain going from gold to purple to gray in the long Colorado dusk, and the air smelled of pine and fresh water and the specific cleanness of high country spring, and Susanna leaned against Nathan's shoulder and he put his arm around her. And they sat in the good silence of people who have been talking to each other for 10 years and still have more to say, and know they will have the time to say it. "Do you ever think about how it started?" she said. He thought for a moment. "Pretty regularly," he said. "I almost didn't knock." "I know," he said. "I heard you stop." She looked up at him. "You heard me stop. Cabin's not that thick," he said, and there was something in his voice that was deeply fond. "I could hear you standing there deciding. And I hoped you'd knock," he said. "Hoped you'd find the nerve, whoever you were." A person standing outside in a blizzard thinking about whether to knock is a person having a harder time of it than I would wish on anyone. She looked at the mountains, darkening now against a sky still pale at the horizon. I almost rode back into it, she said. I know, he said again. She thought about the version of herself that had turned away, ridden back into the blizzard and the cold and the long road of running, and she felt something like grief for that version and something like tremendous gratitude that she had not been her. I am glad, she said, with a simplicity and completeness that contained everything, that I knocked on that door. Nathan pressed a kiss to her hair. So am I, he said. Every single day. The last snow of the season fell that night lightly, the kind of late spring snow that doesn't last. And in the morning it was gone, and the meadow above the cabin was green and bright in the early sun. And Daniel found a meadowlark's nest at the edge of the tree line, and he came running to tell them with the particular radiance of a child who has discovered something marvelous. And they went to look, and the bird sat on her nest in the green grass and looked back at them with bright, unafraid eyes. And Susanna reached for Nathan's hand beside her, and he closed his fingers around hers. And the mountain was full of the sound of water and bird song and the morning, and it was beautiful, and it was theirs, and it was real. This was a life. This was the life. And she had found it in the improbable way that real things are always found at the end of a blizzard, at the threshold of a stranger's door, with her heart pounding and her hands half frozen, and no idea what she was walking into except that she was out of other choices. And the stranger had opened the door and stepped back and let the warmth out into the cold to reach her, and she had walked into it, and she had never walked back out.